On the morning of Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, many Americans were glued to their TV screens, including software consultant David Rostcheck. He watched the terrorist attacks in New York and saw the Twin Towers fall. Later, the man sat down to write an email. It began with the words, "Okay, is it just me, or did anyone else recognize that it wasn't the airplane impacts that blew up the World Trade Center?" Rostcheck claimed that the buildings collapsed as a result of a controlled demolition. Someone had placed explosives in the right spots beforehand and detonated them. The author concluded, "If in a few days not one official has mentioned anything about the demolition part, I think we have a really serious problem." Rostcheck posted his letter on a forum at 1512, meaning just 6 hours after the attack, the first 9/11 conspiracy theory appeared on the internet. Later, there would be many more of these theories, about non-existent planes, staged explosions, conspiracies by intelligence agencies, Zionists, and Freemasons. Among the supporters of alternative interpretations, there would be many public figures, actors, politicians, and bloggers. Donald Trump wouldn't stay on the sidelines either. He would claim that he saw with his own eyes how Muslims celebrated the terrorist attacks.
I watched when the World Trade Center came tumbling down. And I watched in Jersey City, New Jersey, where thousands and thousands of people were cheering as that building was coming down.
That's not true. Right after the tragedy, there were rumors about dancing Arabs, but the information was never confirmed. Trump couldn't have seen people celebrating in New Jersey. There were plenty of such speculations. People were faced with shock and horror. They were trying to understand how the largest terrorist attack in human history was possible and who was behind it. Scientists, experts, and journalists conducted their own investigations alongside the official one. All these versions form the basis of numerous conspiracy theories that are still alive today. Thousands of videos on YouTube are dedicated to this topic. A search for 9/11 conspiracy theory in English yields 6.5 million results, and for 9/11 truth, over 80 million. It's no wonder that many Americans still don't believe the official version today. But what exactly makes people suspicious? Why did this tragedy open a new era of conspiracy theories, and how could one day change the whole world? Let's find out. Before discussing the conspiracy theories, I'll briefly recap the event. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, 4 planes took off from airports in Boston, Washington, and Newark for California. They were hijacked by suicide terrorists and turned into weapons intended to strike buildings vital to the country. Flight 11 was directed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. In the first few minutes, people thought it was a tragic accident until they saw a second plane fly into the South Tower on live television.
Oh my goodness, there's another one.
This seems to be on purpose.
Oh my goodness, now it's obvious, I think, that there's a second plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. I think we have a terrorist attack of proportions that we cannot begin to imagine.
During the attack, there were more than 17,000 people inside the skyscrapers. A fire broke out. The escape route for people on the upper floors was cut off. In desperation, they jumped from the windows. A haunting photo of a falling man who was trapped became part of history. Only 18 employees from the South Tower who were above the impact zone managed to escape. In the North Tower, there were no such survivors at all. Within 2 hours, both 110-story buildings collapsed. Then another skyscraper near the towers collapsed due to fire. The third airliner was headed toward the Pentagon. That is, by the way, the massive headquarters of the US Department of Defense near Washington. The plane flew into the west facade of the building. With the fourth plane, the suicide bombers likely intended to attack the Capitol or the White House, but they didn't make it. Passengers called their loved ones on cell phones and the plane's phones, yes. Those existed, but calls on them were considered expensive. People learned about the previous attacks and revolted. Then the hijackers steered the airliner into the ground. It crashed in a field in the state of Pennsylvania. No one survived. In total, 2,977 people died in the attacks. That's not including the 19 terrorists. Most of the victims were in the Twin Towers. A total of 246 passengers and crew members were on board the 4 planes. All are dead. This attack became the deadliest in American history. President George Bush recorded an address to the nation and said he would use all resources to find the perpetrators. The result was not long in coming. By the very next day, US intelligence reported that the main suspect was Al-Qaeda, an Islamist extremist and terrorist organization based in Afghanistan. The group had already attempted to bring down the Twin Towers 8 years prior. Terrorists detonated a bomb in the garage under the World Trade Center. As a result, 6 people died. More than 1,000 were injured. Back then, the criminals hoped the tower would collapse and knock down the second one, but the building stood firm. Al-Qaeda accused the US and its allies of fueling conflicts in the Islamic world. Its leader, Osama bin Laden, repeatedly made anti-American statements. He issued 2 fatwas in which he declared jihad against the United States of America. The first fatwa was titled Declaration of Jihad Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holiest Sites. The second was the Declaration of the World Islamic Front for Jihad Against Jews and Crusaders. But initially, bin Laden denied his involvement in the attacks, even despite a released video where the Al-Qaeda leader tells a Muslim cleric about the operation's preparation and his joy at the destruction, which exceeded his expectations. By the way, many skeptics later considered this recording to be a fake. Bin Laden took responsibility for what happened several years later, in 2004. After September 11th, the fight against terrorism became a US priority. Troops were sent into Afghanistan to destroy Al-Qaeda and capture bin Laden. Tracking down and killing the organization's leader was only possible 10 years later. And not in Afghanistan, but in Pakistan. The attacks led to long-lasting consequences. A protracted war, stricter air travel rules, and expanded powers for intelligence agencies. All this fueled Americans' doubts about whether those the authorities named were truly behind the attacks, or if something more was hidden behind it.
The South Tower of the World Trade Center, 110 stories tall, collapses to the ground in approximately 10 seconds. 29 minutes later, the North Tower follows suit, also collapsing in approximately 10 seconds.
In April 2005, the documentary film Loose Change appeared on the internet. It immediately became a phenomenon, or as Vanity Fair magazine called it, perhaps the first internet blockbuster. In 2006, the film made the list of the most downloaded videos on Google. By then, it had been viewed at least 25 million times. The video was sold on DVD and even aired on some television channels. Why all the hype? The thing is, the film raises the main questions about the September 11th tragedy. It also lays out the main conspiracy theories. The idea came from 3 young guys from small towns in New York State. They wanted to make a comedy action movie about the government staging the attack. But when screenwriter Dylan Avery started researching the plot, he became convinced the tragedy really was the work of the American authorities. Thus, the feature film became a documentary. To make the first version, Dylan needed $2,000 and a personal laptop. Later, several re-releases would be put out with more professional production. So what exactly does the film tell its viewers? That the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center didn't fall on their own, but as a result of a controlled demolition.
Building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners.
The film claims. The Twin Towers are the first steel-framed skyscrapers in history to be completely destroyed by damage and fire. Buildings of this type have burned before, for example, in Philadelphia in the early 90s. At the time, officials called it the largest fire of the century. But the building didn't collapse. There are other examples of such fires, but each time the result is the same. Skyscrapers don't collapse. Why then did the twins fall? Collisions with planes could lead to local damage, but not to total destruction, as the film's speakers point out.
For the tower to collapse straight down onto itself flies in the face of what we know about steel and how steel behaves.
The authors emphasize, skyscrapers don't fold from fires like a house of cards, yet here they fell, and in just a short 10 seconds. So there are questions about the speed and symmetry of the fall, and also to the multi-ton steel beams that were thrown aside after the buildings collapsed. They flew as far as 150 meters. That's very far from the site of the tragedy. What if they were pushed by a blast wave? Moreover, pyroclastic dust clouds formed after the collapse. They supposedly form in 2 cases, during a volcanic eruption and during a controlled building demolition. There's one more oddity.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like lava.
Some eyewitnesses claim they saw molten metal at the site of the tragedy. A fire couldn't heat steel to its melting point, which is about 1,500 degrees Celsius. Theoretically, the maximum temperature in a building fire is 1,000 degrees, which means there was another factor, explosions, and these same explosions were heard by various eyewitnesses. The film collects interviews recorded on the day of the tragedy.
We're obviously having a bit of trouble right now maintaining our location because we just heard one more explosion.
The street shook, and I felt like I heard like an explosion.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse? To me, it sounded like an explosion
on mezzanine level there, and another explosion came right from it because everyone flying.
One of the first to popularize the theory of rigged buildings was architect Richard Gage. He even founded the organization Architects and Engineers for September 11th Truth. It includes about 3,000 experts. They all suggest that the high-rises were blown up using thermite. In the past, this material has been used to destroy steel structures.
This is a very sophisticated form of incendiary, of thermite, which is called nanothermite.
Why did suspicion fall on these particles? Gage notes that after the World Trade Center attack, experts studied the dust and found thermite material in it. Another researcher, Kevin Ryan, insists that steel cannot melt from ordinary jet fuel.
A lot of people were feeling the same. They were thinking the same thing, that clearly there was something wrong here.
William Rodriguez spoke about the likely planted bombs. He's a janitor at the World Trade Center who became famous for helping lead people out of the skyscraper. He claimed he first heard an explosion in the basement and then felt the plane hit the building. Right after the tragedy, the man gave frequent interviews and was called the last person to leave the tower. But over time, the janitor received less and less attention, and he believes it's because of his vocal claims about basement explosions. Rodriguez, for example, told Russia Today about this.
I believe that censorship started from the very beginning because when I was telling my story, they told me, oh, cut this out, cut this out.
No longer sweetheart of American broadcasts, William now talks mostly to foreign outlets.
A logical question that arises regarding the controlled demolition theory is, who did it? The Organization of Architects and Engineers doesn't dare to make assumptions. They say it's not within their area of expertise. But individual members put forward hypotheses, saying it was a false flag operation, meaning the attack was planned by United States government officials. Some believe they did it along with large corporations linked to the defense industry. Do you think that sounds implausible? Millions of Americans would disagree with you. This theory became so popular that it's often reflected in pop culture in various ways, like in South Park.
I know it seems crazy, but 9/11 was pulled off by our own government, so they could gain support for attacking the Middle East.
What? No.
I know it's hard to believe.
Dude, why would the government attack its own buildings?
It's called the false flag policy. Make it look like the enemy has attacked you. Get all your citizens riled up and waving American flags. Then you're free to invade any country you want.
That's retarded.
We'll talk about possible government involvement later. For now, let's discuss the arguments. Don't you think the situation really is suspicious? Why didn't the sturdy buildings withstand the impacts and collapse in 10 seconds? Where did the molten steel and the sounds of explosions come from? The National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, wanted to find answers to these questions. In 2002, Congress tasked them with conducting an investigation during which experts spoke with survivors, analyzed photos and videos, studied building documentation, and examined steel structures. So what were the conclusions? In their view, the Twin Towers collapsed because of the plane impacts. As a result, support columns were damaged, fireproofing on steel floor trusses was stripped, and jet fuel spilled across several floors. This led to an intense fire. Subsequently, the floor trusses sagged, which triggered the collapse of the towers. But wait. The film Loose Change claimed that the buildings should have withstood the impact of a Boeing 707. Where did that confidence come from? The thing is, in 1945, a B-25 bomber got lost in the fog and crashed into the Empire State Building. After that, structural engineers began to account for such collisions when designing skyscrapers, but no regulations required a building to withstand the impact of a commercial airliner at high speed. Besides, the Boeing 767 was 20% larger than the aircraft mentioned in the film Loose Change. In addition, investigators were unable to find documents specifying the criteria and methods used in the analysis of the impact's consequences. In the 60s, the technical capabilities of the experts who conducted such studies were limited. It proved impossible to confirm the thesis about local rather than fatal damage. More modern NIST approaches allowed for the understanding that the destruction was influenced not only by the mass of the planes, but also by their high speed coupled with inertia. The situation was exacerbated by the spilled fuel and the damage to the fireproofing layer on the floors as a result of the collision. I think it's clear to everyone that the upper floors could have suffered from the impacts. But why did the lower ones collapse? Experts answer that it's a matter of gravitational load. The buildings would have stood if only 6 floors had fallen from above. But there were more, 12 in one case and 29 in the other. And what about the speed of the fall? Did the buildings really collapse in just 10 seconds? In fact, the support structures of both buildings stood for 15 to 25 seconds after the collapse began, meaning the upper floors started to fall first, and only then did the support structures begin to fail. It's hard to see on video because of the dust, but if you pay attention, it's all visible. What will the experts say about the molten steel? They won't argue with physics, will they? For the material to flow, the temperature had to reach 1500 degrees, whereas, as I recall, the burning temperature of jet fuel is only 1000. Researchers say that the steel didn't actually melt. There is no evidence of this. But because of the fire, it softened, its strength decreased, causing the floors and beams to sag. But what about the eyewitness accounts? And these shots of the flowing metal? Actually, it's not steel, but an aluminum alloy that the plane was clad in. It only needs about 550 degrees Celsius to melt. What about the strange clouds mentioned in Loose Change? They're not that strange. Here's the deal. The building collapses. The air inside is compressed, the pressure rises. The air has to go somewhere, and the forceful ejection of smoke as the mass falls is quite expected. But the explosions! There were explosions! Remember, eyewitness William Rodriguez talked about this. It turns out his memories have changed over time. Here's what he said on the day of the attack.
I was on the basement, which is a support floor for the maintenance company, and we hear like a big rumble, not like an impact, like a rumble, like something like moving furniture on a massive way, and all of a sudden we hear another rumble, and a guy comes running into our office, and all his skin was off his body.
So initially it wasn't an explosion, but a rumble like furniture being moved. Most likely it went like this. Sound travels through steel almost 15 times faster than through air. So, when the plane hit the building, the vibration through the steel columns reached the basement, where Rodriguez was, in a fraction of a second. That was the first rumble. Then the second one arrived through the air, which he took for the plane's impact. There's also more objective data. Seismic analysis showed there were no explosions before the plane hit the building. Well, what about the thermite that was found? That's clear evidence of a demolition. The thing is, thermite is a metal compound, and experts say such compounds could be found in the building materials used for construction. Why didn't the experts allow for a deliberate demolition? While a thermite reaction can cut through large steel columns, many thousands of pounds of thermite would need to have been placed inconspicuously ahead of time, remotely ignited, and somehow held in direct contact with the surface of hundreds of massive structural components to weaken the building. This makes it an unlikely substance for achieving a controlled demolition. In 2012, the story took a new turn. Another analysis of the World Trade Center dust was conducted. It revealed carbon steel particles coated in epoxy resin with iron oxide and kaolin clay pigments. No thermite was found. So, what's the conclusion? The collapse of the towers did indeed seem suspicious to many, but all the inconsistencies are explained by calculations and tests. The destruction began exactly on the floors, not in the basement. The collapse time was determined by the scale of damage and the rapid spread of fire. Video evidence shows that the buildings collapsed from the top down. Thus, the US National Institute of Standards and Technology found no evidence for alternative theories that the towers were destroyed by controlled demolition using explosives. You can also take a look at a scientifically based simulation created at Purdue University. Scientists used actual construction blueprints to create a wireframe model of the World Trade Center. They worked for 2 years. It took them thousands of man-hours and 21 days of computer rendering to show just 1 second of real time. But thanks to this, we can clearly see what happens after the impact.
And that doesn't melt the steel, it softens it. And that softening makes the restraints on the columns not as effective, and the column itself becomes soft. So it bends to one side, and of course there is a vertical load on it, and that takes care of it.
The film Loose Change, which contributed greatly to popularizing the conspiracy theory, was heavily criticized. Experts debunked the author's main claims. Interestingly, the creators didn't deny making mistakes in the video, but they explained it as a specific concept. We don't ever come out and say that everything we say is 100%. We know there are errors in the documentary, and we've actually left them in there so that people discredit us and do the research for themselves. That's our whole goal, to make Americans think, but the voices of the doubters are still heard. And they sound loud. This infuriates some experts in a wide variety of fields. For example, an American blacksmith lost his cool and recorded a 2-minute video on YouTube. He took a piece of steel and showed that it doesn't bend. Then he heated it up and demonstrated the effect.
Check it out. It's a freaking noodle. Your argument is invalid. Get over it. Find a job.
There is another mystery that haunts many researchers. Even those who agree that the Twin Towers fell on their own. On September 11th, another building collapsed, building number 7. It's talked about less because there were no casualties. People were evacuated from the high-rise after the attack on the neighboring skyscrapers. Building 7 was about 100 meters from the North Tower, and no plane flew into it. But a fire was raging inside as well. The cause was debris. It hit the building after the collapse of the North Tower. The fire engulfed the lower levels and spread to at least 10 floors, so why did the collapse happen?
You know, building number 7, you see it come down, and we've all watched, because it's cool to watch, you know, these buildings being demolished. Boom, just, you know, free fall. Well, the only way that happens is if you remove all of their supports at the same time. You blow them all out so that a building can really free fall.
This is Senator Ron Johnson. He actively expresses doubts about the official version of September 11th and insists that Building 7 collapsed as a result of a controlled demolition. The senator, by the way, says he gets upset when called a conspiracy theorist and emphasizes that the US government is hiding a lot about the attacks. Johnson shared his doubts with popular journalist Tucker Carlson.
Building 7 was not hit by anything. It's actually quite a distance from the other towers. It's not right next door. It's hundreds of yards away, I think. And debris hit it and it caught fire, and then the whole thing collapsed, as we saw on camera.
Then we went back there. Whoa.
What exactly bothers the proponents of alternative versions? First, the building's smooth fall, which looks just like a controlled demolition. Second, the collapse happened later, 7 hours after the attacks. Third, the high-rise settled as if in free fall, which is supposedly only possible if all load-bearing structures fail at once. And finally, some witnesses claim they heard explosions inside the building. One common argument skeptics cite is a London BBC broadcast where journalists report that Building 7 has collapsed. Even though, in reality, the building was still standing in the shot, and it was actually still standing. This was happening about 20 minutes before the actual collapse. The editor later had to explain that it was a chaotic day, and they mistook a comment about the building's inevitable fall for an event that had already happened. Just in case, he clarified there was no conspiracy in the BBC's reports on those attacks. No one told them what to say. But it's interesting why, according to conspiracy theorists, blow up Building 7 at all. Especially 7 hours later. There were no people there. What's the point? Here's the version they proposed.
And housed offices for Department of Defense, Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Internal Revenue Service. Building 7 was considered the Central Intelligence Agency's largest station outside of Washington, D.C., and was also the Secret Service's biggest field office. Numerous cases would be closed due to its destruction.
There's another motive. Entrepreneur Larry Silverstein built Building 7. He also leased the World Trade Center building shortly before the attack and bought insurance from 24 companies. After the tragedy, he was paid $4.5 billion. Conspiracy theorists believe this is no coincidence and cite a clip from his interview.
Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it.
The English words pull it are taken out of context here and interpreted as slang for blow it up. In reality, insuring such buildings is a very standard procedure. Besides, Silverstein litigated for several years just to get that money. And in the end, it didn't go into his pocket, but toward the reconstruction of the World Trade Center site. How did official investigators respond to the suggestion of intentional demolition? Again, let's look at the NIST report. For 6 years, they conducted a scientific and technical study and found no malicious intent. The fire in Building 7 raged for several hours. It wasn't extinguished, but otherwise, it was similar to the fires in the Twin Towers.
We really have a new kind of progressive collapse that we have discovered here, which is a fire-induced progressive collapse. And in fact, we have shown for the first time that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
Heat from the fires expanded the long support beams, meaning their strength was reduced. This led to the collapse of the floor slabs. Experts found no evidence that explosives were used. The building fell simply because the fire couldn't be contained and the remaining parts weren't strong enough. There's also a video reconstruction of the high-rise's collapse. It shows that on the 13th floor, a beam detached from a critical internal column. The floor collapsed, leading to a cascading fall of other floors already weakened by the fire. Even the weakest explosion capable of disabling a critical column would produce a sound of 130 to 140 decibels at a distance of 800 meters. Just so you understand, that's very loud, about like the sound of a siren or a plane taking off. But witnesses didn't report such extreme noise, and it's not on the video recordings. Besides that, such an explosion would have caused a shockwave, and when the building fell, windows in nearby houses would have blown out. So the theory about Building 7 being blown up also looks untenable. Just 6 months after the attack, the first major book about the conspiracy theories behind September 11th was published. It was written by French journalist Thierry Masson. The book 9/11, The Big Lie, became a bestseller. The main idea of the work is that the attack was an inside job. It was organized by the military lobby to increase the arms budget and the oil lobby, which wanted to lay a pipeline through Central Asia and Afghanistan. The official version is nothing more than a loony fable, patched together by the White House and the Defense Department, so the author writes. Remember, terrorists hijacked a third plane and flew it into the Pentagon building? Well, Mason claims that neither American Airlines Flight 77 nor any other plane crashed into the facility. The book caused a sensation in France. A print run of 20,000 copies was sold out in the first 2 hours after going on sale. The author was invited to various talk shows. Mason's arguments boil down to the fact that there was no plane. Because witness statements are suspicious, they contradict each other and are simply implausible. Video from the scene was not published at that time. There are few photos, and none of them show debris characteristic of a plane crash. Another suspicious point is that the area of destruction in the building is incredibly small. In New York, towers collapsed, but here only a small hole was made. Besides, at first the hole was only 5 meters, although the width of a Boeing, including the wingspan, is 38 meters. That is, the airliner could not have left such a small hole. How is that possible? Mason puts forward a theory. It wasn't a plane that flew into the Pentagon, but a cruise missile. A Pentagon spokesman said the book is a slap in the face and a real offense to the American people, particularly to the memory of the victims of the attacks. But of course, many believe this version. Internet exposés also added to the popularity of the version. Conspiracy theorists said that the location for the attack was not chosen by chance.
The Arlington County After Action Report states that important budget information was in the damaged area. It's interesting that 24 hours prior, Donald Rumsfeld publicly made this announcement.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
That is, conspiracy theorists claim the US Secretary of Defense first reports that the department cannot track where $2.3 trillion were spent. The next day, a terrorist attack occurs exactly in the place where the accounting department is located. Why isn't that a reason for suspicion? Even famous podcaster Joe Rogan views such a coincidence with distrust.
We'll keep looking. Oh no, the spot where we looked just blew up.
Oh my God.
And no one talks about that $1 trillion?
True, there is one catch. Secretary Rumsfeld did indeed speak on September 10th, but the missing money had been reported earlier, more than a year before that. Besides, conspiracy theorists misinterpret the words. Trillions of dollars didn't vanish. They were just unaccounted for, meaning accounting entries weren't backed by proper audits and controls. Simply put, they were used as intended, but the spending wasn't properly recorded. It's a big issue, maybe even a legal violation, and someone could lose their job over it, but they probably wouldn't fire a cruise missile at the Pentagon just for that. But what about the missile itself? How relevant are the arguments about its impact? Actually, not at all. There are numerous eyewitness accounts. They saw a plane, not a missile. Some even spotted the American Airlines logo on the side.
What kind of plane was it?
American Airlines.
It came streaking down and hit short. It didn't go into the top of the Pentagon. It came like in short, and then everything sprayed up like a fireball.
By the way, the book's author, Mason, never visited the United States to investigate or interview witnesses. Despite the author's claim that there was no debris at the crash site, there was. They found landing gear parts, an engine, fuselage fragments, plus the black boxes, the cockpit voice recorder, and the flight data recorder. In addition, remains of passengers and crew members were found. They were identified using DNA tests, a total of 184 victims. Perhaps the strongest argument from conspiracy theorists is the small size of the hole the plane left in the Pentagon building. In reality, the airliner punched a hole nearly 23 meters wide, not 5, as skeptics claimed. Here is a photo from the scene. But a Boeing is still bigger. It is 38 meters wide. The explanation is simple. The thing is, the wings broke off earlier. One disintegrated upon hitting the ground, the other tore off on impact with the building because it could not penetrate reinforced concrete. But the damage and casualties could have been worse if not for a stroke of luck. Renovations were underway at the Pentagon then, and some stuff had been moved to other sectors. Moreover, the exact part of the building the plane hit had already been reinforced with steel columns. This also became fuel for conspiracy theories. Supposedly, the hijackers knew where to aim the jet to cause minimal destruction. But here, you have to decide. Did the plane crash very luckily? Right where it needed to hit to hide the accounting records? Or did it crash very unluckily, right where the Pentagon had pre-reinforced the building so it would not collapse from an attack? Of course, according to the official version, a terrorist attack occurred at the Pentagon. A hijacked plane hit the building, not a missile. Numerous pieces of evidence confirm this. The fourth plane has been surrounded by no less strange conspiracy theories. Let me remind you, Flight 93 was flying from Newark to San Francisco. The Boeing was the last to be hijacked. The terrorists turned the airliner around and headed for Washington. Presumably, the target was the Capitol building or the White House. When the plane was hijacked, the passengers learned about the deadly attacks on the Twin Towers. Then they decided to organize a revolt and regain control of the vessel. We know about this, among other things, because there were phones in the plane's cabin and people called their loved ones, exchanged information, and said goodbye.
Having a real problem on the plane. I'm totally fine. I just love you more than anything, just know that.
I'm on United 93 and it's been hijacked by terrorists who say they have a bomb. Apparently they have flown a couple of planes into the World Trade Center already and it looks like they're going to take this one down as well. Mostly I just wanted to say I love you and I'm going to miss you. and these people I love so much. And mostly I just love you, and I just wanted to tell you that. I don't know if I'm going to get a chance to tell you that again or not.
I hope to be able to see your face again, baby. I love you. Bye.
The phrase of one of the passengers, Todd Beamer, "Let's roll," went down in history. He uttered this phrase before he, along with other passengers, tried to break into the cockpit. Subsequently, this slogan became a symbol of the American troops in the fight against terrorism. The suicide bombers directed the plane into the ground. The airliner crashed in the middle of a field in Pennsylvania. As a result of the terrorist attack, 40 people died. The heroic behavior of the passengers made it possible to avoid greater casualties. Their feat was celebrated in cinema. For example, the films United 93 and Flight 93 are dedicated to this. What doubts can conspiracy theorists have in this case? Everything seems transparent. The passengers themselves told over the phone about the hijacked plane and the plan to repel the terrorists. The hijackers' conversations were recorded, who first rock the airliner from side to side to hinder the rebels, then go into a dive. What is suspicious here? Firstly, the amount of debris. There is too little of it, and some was found as far as 2 kilometers from the field in Indian Lake. An alternative theory is that the Boeing was shot down by the American military and it began to fall apart in the air. In addition, a white plane flew near the airliner, which was mistaken for a US Air Force fighter. In fact, this plane was a private vessel of an American clothing and footwear company. It was flying nearby by coincidence, but how then to explain the airliner debris 2 kilometers from the site of the tragedy? Indeed, scraps of metal and paper were found in the lake. They could well have been thrown up upon impact with the ground, and the wind threw the light pieces further away. But it must be said that the assumptions about fighters do not look completely improbable. Already in flight, it became known that the plane had been hijacked. One of the terrorists, by mistake, instead of addressing the passengers of his own hijacked plane, informed the air traffic control center that there was a bomb on board and everyone needed to stay in their seats. In addition, relatives and loved ones of the passengers received information about the hijacked airliner and passed it on to the authorities. One of the main arguments for conspiracy theorists, President George Bush authorized shooting down all hijacked planes. But this happened only after Flight 93 had already crashed in a field. So, yes, even according to official data, the orders were given. The fighter jets just didn't have time to act on them. But some believed that Flight 93 landed safely in Cleveland, and it was another plane that crashed. Actually, it was just a simple mistake. The plane was confused with another Delta Airlines flight. The report was later debunked. The author said he took the story down, but the office started getting messages and calls asking why the government forced him to delete the article. The story was posted on several blogs, which fueled even more interest in the situation. Even more fringe theories emerged, even by the standards of the conspiracy world. For instance, that there was no hijacking at all. The whole thing was staged. Dean Hartwell laid out his idea in the book, Planes Without Passengers. He claimed to have found documentary evidence that 2 hijacked planes never took off, while 2 others landed safely in secret locations. In his version, the attacks on the buildings were part of a pre-planned operation, carried out by the White House and the Pentagon. But of course, this theory doesn't hold up. The author wants us to believe that nearly 250 passengers and crew didn't die in the attacks, but DNA tests prove otherwise. Plus, there are black boxes and recorded calls from the planes where people describe the hijacking. But there's an even more shocking theory, that actually, no planes ever hit the Twin Towers. You might ask a fair question, how is that even possible when there's so much video footage of the planes flying into the skyscrapers? Conspiracy theorists would say, don't believe your eyes. What you're seeing is a hologram. Former MI5 officer David Shaler said in an interview, and I quote, "I believe no planes were involved in 9/11. The only explanation is that they were missiles surrounded by holograms made to look like planes. Watch footage, frame by frame, and you will see a cigar-shaped missile hitting the World Trade Center." I'm not sure which specific footage he's talking about. In the TV broadcast, you can clearly see a Boeing flying into the building from multiple angles. Technology in 2001 wasn't advanced enough to project a hologram in mid-flight that would fool the human eye. Besides, there are accounts from thousands of eyewitnesses who saw the planes flying. And of course, there are the terrorists who hijacked the planes. Where do conspiracy theorists think they all went? They say they never existed, that the lists of the hijackers' names were fabricated. In general, the internet has allowed an alternative view of the September 11th tragedy to take shape and spread. Websites and various materials were created offering possible explanations for what happened. Consumers of this content might believe everything at once. That the attacks were government planned, that there were no hijackers or they were plants, that the planes were remotely piloted into the World Trade Center towers, and that a controlled demolition was carried out using pre-planted explosives. That Building 7 was destroyed the same way, a missile hit the Pentagon and the 4th plane was shot down by American fighter jets. That all the calls and other evidence were faked. What makes people think this way? There are many strange points that baffle investigators.
And it spawned an even more sinister conspiracy, that some people knew about the attacks before they occurred and chose to enrich themselves instead of using that information to help prevent them happening in the first place.
A month before the attacks, market analysts noticed unusual trading activity. 2 airlines, American Airlines and United Airlines, saw highly unusual discrepancies in the put-to-call option ratio, 25 and sometimes even 100 times higher than normal. Options are bets on whether the price of a 100-share block will rise or fall by a certain date. A put is a short position, a bet on the stock falling, while a call is a bet on it rising. So, a few days before September 11th, the volume of put options on United Airlines stock was nearly 100 times higher than usual. And for American Airlines, the put-to-call ratio was 6-1. That's strange. There was no noteworthy news in those days, meaning the ratio should have been roughly 1-1. But it all became clear when, on September 11th, terrorists hijacked planes from those exact airlines. A few days later, when the stock exchange opened, the markets crashed. Airline stocks dropped by about 40%. Some traders made millions. A theory emerged that they were warned about the attacks in advance and decided to profit from the tragedy, or perhaps the terrorists themselves took advantage and decided to make some money on the market.
When the stock plunged to $18 after the attack, executing those contracts would mean buying at $18 and selling at $30, a profit of more than $10 each. Making that bet blind would be incredibly stupid, but if you knew for sure that the attacks were coming 2 days later, then there's no risk.
Admit it, it really is suspicious. Official investigators thought so too. The United States Securities and Exchange Commission, along with the FBI and other agencies, conducted an investigation to see if there was insider trading, quote. The SEC and the FBI, aided by other agencies and the securities industry, devoted enormous resources to investigating this issue, including securing the cooperation of many foreign governments. These investigators have found that the apparently suspicious consistently proved innocuous. The agencies found no evidence that any traders had advanced knowledge of the attacks. However, the commission did not release most of the evidence gathered to the public. And that raised questions. Independent studies were conducted that confirmed unusual activity in the options market in the days before September 11th. All of this is consistent with investors trading with prior knowledge of the attacks. 10 financial instruments show signs of insider trading with a high statistical probability. The combined probability that all of this is nothing more than a random coincidence seems astronomically low. That's what many researchers write. Others counter that any insider with information about the September 11th attacks wouldn't have traded airline stock options directly in such large volumes. That would draw too much attention to themselves. In any case, there is no direct evidence that information was leaked to traders by government members or Al-Qaeda. But these aren't all the oddities that raise questions. Why couldn't the experienced and professional US Air Force intercept any of the 4 planes hijacked by terrorists? And how did it happen that the military didn't react to the danger in time? It's no wonder that assumptions about potential beneficiaries are immediately constructed. After all, supposedly such devastating consequences didn't occur by chance. It's the result of a conspiracy, and not by Al-Qaeda, but by internal enemies. But who exactly? Let's start with the basics. The attack was allegedly organized by Jews, or specifically the Israeli Mossad. Remember the dancing Muslims Trump mentioned at the beginning of the video? A similar joyful reaction to the tragedy is also attributed to Jews. There's an idea that influential Israelis conspired with the Bush administration to organize the attacks. In fact, indeed, in the territory controlled by Israel, crowds celebrated the September 11th attack. But there's a catch. These were Arab Palestinians in East Jerusalem. Why Israel would organize attacks is, I think, clear: to invade Iraq and other Middle Eastern countries and gain control over their resources. There's even a version that 4,000 Jews didn't show up for work at the World Trade Center on September 11th. Perhaps the Syrian newspaper Al Thawra was the first to report this. Some claimed that Israeli intelligence services warned their people of the danger in advance. Needless to say, all of this turned out to be just rumors. There's no confirmation of this information. And yes, Jews are listed among the victims of September 11th. They make up about 15% of those killed at the World Trade Center. Despite this, the idea of a Jewish connection to the attacks is in demand, especially in recent years.
Ignited again by what's happened in Gaza, that Israel was somehow implicated in 9/11. It was in their interests for that to happen because then it would lead rage against all their enemies in the Middle East and so on.
I don't repeat every theory about it. They're endless. I'm not an anti-Semite, obviously. I'm not even anti-Israel on some principled level.
Journalist Tucker Carlson is one of the popularizers of various conspiracy theories. He makes documentaries about September 11th and interviews controversial speakers. These speakers, for example, talk about a curious coincidence that 6 months before the tragedy, a prediction was shown on television.
6 months or so after 9/11, listeners start saying, have you seen this? And I had listeners send me VHS recordings off Fox TV of this episode where a criminal group in the U.S. government hijacks a jumbo jet in New York to fly it in the World Trade Center to blame it on a Central Asian terrorist so that they have a pretext to take over domestically with a police state and launch wars in the Middle East.
Wait, this was on the X-Files?
Yes, this was on the X-Files.
We're talking about the X-Files spin-off called The Lone Gunman. In the pilot episode, we see a passenger plane lose control and unknown people guide it remotely. Guess where these unknown people are directing it? That's right, a New York skyscraper.
The corner of Liberty and Washington. Lower Manhattan.
World Trade Center. We're going to crash the plane into the World Trade Center.
In the episode, the heroes manage to regain control and avoid a collision. The episode claims the US government organized the terrorist attack.
I still think we should call in a bomb threat. Let the FBI deal with this.
Said yourself we don't know the full extent of this conspiracy. We can't trust any government official.
Naturally, a plot so close to reality caught the eye of conspiracy theorists, including a leading proponent of alternative theories, Alex Jones. Jones himself claims to have a gift for prophecy because 2 months before September 11th, he said the following.
The point is, if any terrorism comes, it's from this government. And if there was an outside threat like a bin Laden, who was a known CIA asset in the 80s, running the Mujahideen war, and whose family builds all the military bases over in Saudi Arabia right now, and sits on the board of Iridium Satellite, he's the boogeyman they need.
Alex Jones is a controversial figure in the US media landscape. He's been called the most paranoid man in America and the king of conspiracy theories. He's known for bold claims about the formation of a new world order, forced eugenics, and a globalist conspiracy. Jones immediately claimed that the US government orchestrated September 11th and called for President Bush's impeachment. He's certain the towers fell due to a controlled demolition and bin Laden was just a front.
So I knew that bin Laden had been CIA going back to really the Mujahideen being set up by Zbigniew Brzezinski and Jimmy Carter. Then Reagan took that over. And then they kind of build that as blowback. But even recently, you've seen the U.S. aid information and other documents come out in the Institute for Peace where they're directly paying massive amounts of money to Taliban, to Al-Qaeda, to ISIS, even in the last few years.
Oh, yeah.
And they use them as these proxy armies.
You probably think Jones is voicing some fringe theory, but that's not the case at all. In conspiracy circles, this is mainstream. 1 in 5 Americans believes the US government was behind the September 11th attacks.
Do you mean that President Bush and his administration were behind 9/11?
I mean that even mainstream news reported that the hijackers were ordered to be allowed into the United States. Governments have staged terror attacks throughout history or allowed terrorists to attack as a pretext to invade and enslave the populations.
So why is the idea of a false flag operation taken so seriously? The reason lies in an actual program called Northwoods. In the 60s, CIA agents were to carry out a series of attacks on US military and civilian targets, including staging aerial attacks using remote-controlled planes. They wanted to blame Cuba to create a pretext for military intervention. The plan was presented to then-President John F. Kennedy, but he rejected it. The operation was never carried out, but the idea stuck in the public consciousness. Director Michael Moore played a major role in popularizing the idea of US government involvement in September 11th. He released the successful documentary Fahrenheit 9/11. The author hints at the president's involvement in the attacks and explores close ties between the Bush and bin Laden clans. Moore focuses on the president's behavior on the morning of September 11th. Bush arrived at an elementary school in Florida and sat in a classroom with children. That's when he was informed about the plane crashing into the skyscraper. He bit his lip and continued reading the book.
Nearly 7 minutes passed with nobody doing anything.
Later, the president would be frequently criticized for his reaction, or rather, the lack of action in those first minutes. Even fringe theories emerged, claiming Bush was performing a ritual, reading the book The Pet Goat. This animal is considered satanic, meaning the attacks were nothing but a sacrifice to Baphomet. Not convinced by this argument? Strange. Here's another one. The children in the class supposedly chanted the words kite, hit, steal, plane, must, words that predicted the attack.
Get ready. Kite. Yes, kite. Get ready. Hit. Yes, hit. Get ready. Steal. Yes, steal. Get ready. Plane. Yes, plane. Get ready. Must. Yes, must.
In reality, they were saying kite, kit, steal, playing, must. The theory relies on auditory pareidolia, where we hear not what's actually said, but what's written on the screen. Besides that, the children were learning other words, smile and cake. But conspiracy theorists, of course, don't mention that. Let's get back to Moore's film. He says intelligence agencies flew bin Laden's family out of America right after the attack, and that Bush hindered the investigation after September 11th, but an independent commission was eventually formed over a year after the tragedy. A public report with the findings was released, but it faced criticism. The thing is, the final part of the document was classified, just 28 pages. Theories were built around the missing information, such as a Saudi connection to the attacks. The papers weren't declassified until 2016. It turned out the Saudi embassy in Washington may have funded dry-run hijackings by 2 Saudi nationals. 2 years before the attacks, they paid for the flights of 2 students as part of the preparations for the September 11th attacks. Reportedly, during an America West flight to Washington in November 1999, the men tried to enter the cockpit several times to test security before the hijacking. The pilots were spooked by the passengers' aggressive behavior and made an emergency landing in Ohio. The FBI questioned the Saudi students but decided not to pursue a case. Declassified documents revealed that these 2 were frequently in contact with Saudi officials and received money from them. This proves that close ties existed between certain members of the Saudi government and Al-Qaeda, and that the FBI could have actually done a much better job and prevented the attacks. Director Michael Moore also focuses on this topic in his film. He points out that 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. Moore highlights the Bush family's special relationship with the kingdom.
Another group of people invest in you, your friends, and their related businesses $1.4 billion over a number of years, because that's how much the Saudi royals and their associates have given the Bush family,
Morning, everybody. Oh, we know
their friends,
How are you, sir?
and their related businesses in the past 3 decades.
Seems like a very nice reunion with friends.
Journalist Bob Woodward also confirms the close ties between Bush and Saudi Arabia in his book, Plan of Attack, both economic and political. Supposedly, before the presidential election, the kingdom's ambassador promised to increase oil production to lower gas prices and improve the situation for George W. Bush. In general, oil often appears in theories as the reason for the September 11th terrorist attacks. Supposedly, the attacks were organized intentionally to then invade Afghanistan and Iraq. Here is what Moore's film says about it.
And the reason they had to do Afghanistan first was it was obvious that al-Qaeda had attacked us, and it was obvious that al-Qaeda was in Afghanistan. The American people wouldn't have stood by if we had done nothing on Afghanistan.
But the organizers in this case could be not only the government but also corporations. This point of view is voiced by another popular conspiracy theorist, actor, and former Minnesota Governor Jesse Ventura.
Wars are very profitable to certain big businesses, and of course big business needs to be in the Middle East so that we can get the oil out of the Middle East, so we can get the lithium out of Afghanistan.
Another popular version is that American intelligence services are behind the terrorist attacks. There is even a notion that the CIA financed Osama bin Laden. The United States did indeed provide financial support to the Mujahideen. The operation was named Cyclone, but in reality, the agency did not sponsor bin Laden as part of this operation. On the contrary, the terrorist, along with the US authorities and independently of them, financed the Mujahideen himself. Well, yes, it turns out that at that moment they were on the same side. And a few more crazy theories for the collection. The terrorist attack was beneficial to the Freemasons. This is discussed online and promoted by some authors. For example, there is a book called 9/11. As a mass ritual, it says that the terrorist attack was organized as part of a global occult ritual. Lucifer, black magic, and of course the Freemasons are involved here. In addition, the conspirators left clues in advance that they were planning to organize a deadly performance, but for some reason they did it with the help of the British rock band Supertramp.
Take a look at my girlfriend. She's the only one I got.
The music album Breakfast in America was released in '79. It earned a bunch of awards and became the best-selling in the band's history. And it also predicted September 11th. The idea originated on a forum in the 2010s. What's the point? Look at the album cover. First, the panorama of New York is seen through a porthole. Second, the waitress, depicting the Statue of Liberty, holds a glass near the World Trade Center, where planes would later crash. Third, pay attention to the letters U and P in the title. They are located exactly above the skyscrapers. And if you hold the record up to a mirror, the numbers 9 and 1 appear.
And also, if anybody knows anything about the Bible, in Revelations it talks about the great whore of Babylon. If you use a synonym for super, it means great. Tramp, whore, great whore. And you also look on the back cover, there's an airplane flying above the New York skyline with the Twin Towers right there.
And there's a reference to the fateful event in the album's title. After all, the terrorist attack was planned to take place in the morning during breakfast. Conspiracy theorists are sure that this cannot be a coincidence. Besides, the group's financier, Stanley August Misa might have been a Mason because he wore a pendant around his neck that looked Masonic. That's the level of evidence they have. Admit it, it's hard to believe that 20 years before the attack, Masons were hinting at it with a single cover. We could list crazy versions for a long time, but let's try to sum things up. So, what is known for certain? The FBI investigation into the September 11th attacks became the largest in US history. 7,000 employees took part in it. Intelligence established that same day that al-Qaeda organized the action. Unpleasant details came to light. American intelligence agencies were receiving information about the impending attack. The US National Security Agency intercepted telephone conversations of the group's members. The CIA knew from Saudi Arabian authorities that 2 people who trained at a flight school in San Diego had become members of al-Qaeda. But the agency decided not to share this information with its colleagues, neither with the State Department nor the FBI. By August, the CIA knew for sure from various sources that bin Laden was preparing an attack on US soil, possibly involving plane hijackings. But they failed to prevent the tragedy due to a lack of information sharing practices between different agencies. It's no surprise that such a major event and its aftermath spawned many conspiracy theories. But after a detailed study of the arguments, it became clear to researchers that most claims are far-fetched and incorrect. But one theory, which initially looked like a conspiracy theory, turned out to be true.
Asbestos was in there, is in those buildings, lead is in those buildings. There are the VOCs. However, the concentrations are such that they don't pose a health hazard.
Immediately after the attack on the World Trade Center, work began to clear the aftermath. Thousands of New Yorkers and emergency service workers were exposed to dust, smoke, and fumes. They contained volatile chemical substances. Initially, the Environmental Protection Agency claimed the air was safe and people wouldn't have health problems. But doubters emerged immediately. They claimed the agency was hiding the truth. Some people felt the effects of dust, asbestos, metals, and other toxins almost immediately. They faced respiratory illnesses. The level of air pollution was high and only decreased by January or February of 2002. It later became known that the responders developed numerous health problems related to the pulmonary, cardiovascular, and nervous systems. Rescuers developed cancer much more often than the average citizen. The article called it the toll of heroism. American scientists also concluded that responders have a significantly higher risk of developing dementia before the age of 65. Moreover, this risk increases in proportion to the level of contact with dust and other debris during the cleanup. Former EPA head Christy Whitman later denied that there was deliberate misinformation from the agency. The statements were based on expert data who at the time didn't say they had information about long-term public health threats. Victims filed numerous lawsuits against the New York City authorities. This happened because officials urged people to return to Lower Manhattan shortly after the attacks. They said everything was safe and you could return. Victims sought compensation for medical costs related to illnesses caused by the aftermath of the attack. Debris removal efforts continued all the way until 2002. By May, over 108,000 truckloads of debris had been hauled to the landfill. Fires burned for several months, leaving Lower Manhattan shrouded in smoke and dust with a pungent smell of burning rubber, plastic, and steel. The September 11th Memorial Museum opened at the site of the World Trade Center. It's dedicated to the memory of the attack victims and the first responders. The collection has over 80,000 exhibits that tell the stories of those involved in the events. Right where the Twin Towers once stood, they opened a memorial called Reflecting Absence. It became the most expensive monument in the US, costing over $700 million. 2 fountains were installed exactly at the base of the former towers. Streams of water flow down their inner walls. They symbolize the endless tears for those who perished. The parapet of both fountains is lined with massive bronze plates inscribed with the names of every victim of the attack. An oak grove is planted around the monument, including the so-called survivor tree. It grew near the North Tower and was rescued from the rubble. The September 11th terrorist attacks had significant consequences. The World Trade Center was one of the largest financial hubs in the world. Because of the attack, American markets were closed for almost a week. This led to one of the record crashes in the US economy. According to the New York Times, the damage amounted to $3.3 trillion. The tragedy irrevocably changed American defense and security policy. The US began a global war on terror. It led to wars in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. Rules changed inside the country as well. The powers of the intelligence services were significantly expanded. The US National Security Agency was granted the right to conduct surveillance without a court warrant. In 2002, the notorious Guantanamo prison began operating. In it, hundreds of prisoners were subjected to mistreatment due to suspicions of terrorism. The prison became a symbol of human rights violations by Americans. Some dubbed it a torture center. It's still operating today. Another consequence is ICE's activity in the US. Those agents whose work now causes concern for some and leads to protests we've covered on this channel. The tightening of immigration control both at the border and within the country was a consequence of September 11th. The immigration service was then reorganized and reimagined. Migrants were no longer seen as a civil matter, but as a potential threat to the country. More obvious changes are related to the strengthening of security measures at airports around the world. Arriving hours before departure, going through multiple screenings and carry-on restrictions are all direct consequences of September 11th. Traveling used to be easier. For domestic flights, you could arrive 20 minutes before departure and still make it to the gate. Those seeing people off could easily walk the traveler right to the gate. Those seeing people off might not even have an ID on them. The screening was formal. After all, the main thing was passenger convenience. Essentially, planes operated like sky taxi. Pilot safety was also lacking. Nowadays, to prevent criminals from entering, cockpit doors are reinforced. Before, they were less sturdy and sometimes even remained open during the flight. After September 11th, airport queues are the norm. Everyone undergoes a thorough screening. There's baggage and carry-on inspection, body scanners, and biometric checks. Now, the priority is not convenience, but security. And of course, the attack ushered in a new era of conspiracy theories. At least that's what the American media says.
Anyone who doubts the official narrative is cast as a kook, a criminal, a fringe conspiracy theorist, and punished. They've been blacklisted and censored and banned. Even as the leaders who failed to protect our country on 9/11 used these attacks as a pretense to expand their own powers and permanently transform the United States. None of this is speculation. All of it is true.
Many popular media outlets in America broadcast various conspiracy theories, and it's not a result of Trump's presidency, as some authors claim. There were several turning points. These include the JFK assassination, Watergate, and one of the most significant came right after the September 11th attacks. The George W. Bush administration organized a campaign against Iraq. Later, this campaign was dubbed Powell's test tube. U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell addressed the UN with a report on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction and showed a vial with some powder.
This is just about the amount of a teaspoon. Less than a teaspoonful of dry anthrax in an envelope shut down the United States Senate in the fall of 2001. This forced several hundred people to undergo emergency medical treatment and killed 2 postal workers just from an amount just about this quantity that was inside of an envelope.
After that, the Americans invaded Iraq, but no weapons of mass destruction were found there. Later, Powell called this speech a great intelligence failure. Writer David Korn noted that the disinformation campaign launched ahead of the Iraq War was one of the first examples of the post-truth era, and it also contributed to the crisis of institutional legitimacy. Over the years, citizens became convinced that manipulation and lies can be part of a political strategy, and politicians actively use disinformation and conspiracy theories. Many believe that September 11, 2001 can be called the start date of the 21st century. A new era began, leading us to live in times of militant populism and destruction. Where all this will lead us, one can only guess. Something like that.